All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted that we have Amy Zegart with us to discuss her latest book, the same title. The book is featured on the screen, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The History and Future of American Intelligence. Amy has been analyzing the challenges that American intelligence faces for the last 30 years. She is a professor at Stanford University, where she is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. Amy is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and her writings are read with avid interest here at the Spy Museum. And so Hannah's going to share an image of one of our exhibits called Fateful Failures. You can see it there towards the left. And when the team was working on this gallery, Amy's article from 2013 in Foreign Policy entitled "No One Saw This Coming" was influential as the team considered how to present the challenges that individuals in the intelligence field face, predicting what is or isn't coming down the track. How do you know, and how can you guess, and how do you predict? And just this morning, an opinion piece by our executive director, Chris Costa, was published in response to Amy's thoughts on pop culture. A little bit more on that in just a couple minutes. Amy, thank you for being with us today.
Amanda, thanks so much for having me. I'm such a huge fan of the Spy Museum.
That is so nice to hear. And so we have a lot of joint admiration going here. Your book is quite an overview. You were telling me that my tabs warmed your heart. I really have enjoyed spending time with it. And it is a really wide-ranging overview, ranging from, U.S. history, the origins of our intelligence efforts, and through to current vulnerabilities and future threats. So there's really no way to cover the breadth of this in our conversation. So I'm going to try to track my questions to the flow of the book. And as promised, I'm going to start with pop culture, since Chris was writing about an article that you wrote, which was drawn from the book. And at Spy, as you know, we are always trying to leverage pop culture to help the public understand the reality of spying, kind of our way in. But you have some real concerns, and they seem very valid, about pop culture. And I'm wondering if you would share some of those with us.
Well, sure. So really the origins of the book had to do with pop culture. So I was at the time at UCLA, and I was teaching my students, and I polled them about what they knew about intelligence and where they got their information from. And the results were really striking. So most of them didn't know anything about intelligence. And what they did know, they learned from the movies and from TV. And what I learned was that those who said they frequently watched spy-themed entertainment had different attitudes, statistically significant different attitudes about intelligence and counterterrorism tactics. And so that got me sort of down this path. And what I found in doing national polls and then digging more deeply into how pop culture affects policy is that spy-themed entertainment, or what I like to call spytainment, really has had two big effects. Number one, it has absolutely influenced public opinion on everything from Edward Snowden to waterboarding, you name it. You see statistically significant differences in people who are frequent spytainment consumers than those who aren't. And the second thing I found is a number of examples where spy-themed entertainment affects policymakers. We all love spy-themed entertainment. So it actually shouldn't come as a surprise that Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, and others are actually ingesting spy-themed entertainment too. So I found things like in confirmation hearings for the CIA director, questions based on fictional plot lines. I found Supreme Court justices reasoning about real issues based on what Jack Bauer would do. So it really has influenced how policymakers think about intelligence challenges, not just public opinion.
I want to ask you a follow-up question. Jack Bauer seemed to feature really predominantly in some of your findings. Do you want to sort of spell those out a little bit more?
Sure. So, I think when we think about spy themed entertainment, generally there are sort of three myths that we get about the intelligence community. I'll take a step back. One is, and this is the Jack Bauer part, torture always works, right? They're going to start singing like a canary as soon as you really put the screws to them. The second is that intelligence officers are running rogue, right? There's no oversight. They can do whatever they want on the streets of New York, and they can go out and kill people. We know that's not true either. And the third is this sort of omnipotent techno surveillance state that the National Security Agency is listening to your telephone calls with your grandmother, right? We get that from the movies too. And so what I found in particular with Jack Bauer is that this question about ticking time bombs and what are you willing to do with interrogations to get the information you think you need is very much a part of a lot of thinking that we see post 9/11. Even though experts have long said ticking time bomb scenarios are totally unrealistic and don't happen. So, you see a lot of questions being asked of presidential candidates, for example. What would you do in a ticking time bomb scenario? Not so helpful, actually, to use those fictional plot lines.
Thank you. It was really, and for those who have the pleasure of reading the book, there is a lot of great data, or scary data, if you will, backing up the things that Amy is sharing with us. And as we know from the spy movies and films and TV that we love, a lot of the things that we see are covert action because it makes great stuff to watch. And so I'm wondering, you quote General Mike Hayden when he talks about the edgy things and these blurred lines. And we actually have in our covert action gallery a wheel of fortune, because it shows you a chance for visitors to just take the wheel, spin the wheel, and see what the outcomes of covert action can be, because they're so very dicey. What the results can be. So can you tell me a little bit about what your findings have told you about covert action and the results, and is it worth it, and some interesting stuff about the presidents who've used it too?
Yeah, so I took quite a long time to delve more deeply into covert action in the book. And I found a couple things that I think most people may not know. I think this group probably does, but my students typically don't know. And one is that almost every type of covert action has an overt counterpart. So I think there tends to be this myth that covert action is some special bag of dirty tricks that intelligence officers go out and use that they can't really talk about in the light of day. And that actually is not true. It's not a special bag of dirty tricks. Almost every covert action has an overt counterpart. So for example, when regime change is done covertly, it's usually called a coup. When it's done overtly, it's called a war. Right? So we actually wage war to change regimes. In fact, in the 90s, Congress passed the Iraqi Liberation Act, which explicitly called for the ouster of Saddam Hussein and allocated money to achieve that result. You can't get more overt than that. So I think, we talk about economic oriented covert action. When it's done overtly, it's called economic sanctions against our adversaries. So that's the first thing that I thought was really important to sort of pull out in the chapter on covert action. But the other thing I found is, I'm a political scientist, so I look for generalities, what systematically explains what we find. And I found every president uses covert action, even those who say when they're campaigning that they don't like it and want to have a human rights-based foreign policy. So Jimmy Carter campaigned against the CIA in particular. He ended up using covert action as much as his predecessor. Barack Obama, constitutional law professor, talked a lot on the campaign trail about that. He ended up using covert action a lot as well. So when you have that many different presidents with that varied a background using the same toolkit, it tells you that there's something systematically useful about this tool. So why do presidents use covert action? Why do they all use it? Well, number one, it's that third option between war and doing nothing, right? They can do something. Number two, going covert, meaning not acknowledging US government responsibility for something, can make something more feasible, right? Other allies and partners can help us if it's done quietly, not overtly. And then the third is the useful fig leaf, right? So even if everyone knows that something is technically a covert action, it can be incredibly useful from a political standpoint. So the Osama bin Laden raid, for example, was technically carried out under covert action authorities by the CIA. Why? Because it provided a graceful cover for when Pakistan found out that we had gone through to sovereign airspace, it wasn't as humiliating, it wasn't as charged. It provided, as Robert Gates wrote, a useful fig leaf. So there are reasons why all presidents use it, even though it often fails. I liken covert action, Amanda, to the 3-point shots in basketball. I'm a basketball fan. If we graded, LeBron James only by the number of 3-point shots that he made, you'd say he's not a very good basketball player. Covert action often fails because it's the 3-point shot of foreign policy. When you're in covert action territory, you've got bad options, and it's the best option of a series of bad options.
Yeah, we try to get the message to people that it is so not everything, you collect the information in various ways and you make sense of it and then you take action. And, we struggle with the fact that, of course, we've got this glorious gallery on covert action because we've got all these incredible artifacts and stories to tell, but we want, trying to make it clear, covert action is just one thing that can happen, but gosh, it makes for a good movie or a museum gallery. So, and it's something people are fascinated by. And so that leads me into something I didn't think I would be fascinated by in your book, but I was, and that is your perspective on U.S. congressional oversight committees. I really got a lot out of reading about some of the structural challenges they face, and you've worked with these committees. Can you tell us more about what that's like and the challenges they face?
So what I found, Amanda, is that there are really structural reasons why oversight is always problematic. There are ups and downs over time, to be sure, but in general, oversight of intelligence is poor. And it's not because of who runs the committees or who happens to be president. It's about incentives and institutions. So when you think about what do members of Congress get rewarded for doing? They get rewarded for doing things in public. They get rewarded for helping their constituents. And from that perspective, intelligence oversight is a loser, right? They can't talk about what they do. It takes a lot of time to learn about intelligence. I found that Congress has more experts today in powdered milk than they do in intelligence, because there are so many dairy districts where members of Congress have to learn about the dairy industry in order to get reelected. There's no dairy district equivalent for intelligence that is incentivizing members of Congress going in the door to really get smart on intelligence issues. They have to learn on the job. And then that leads to institutional challenges, right? So Congress has tied its own hands when it comes to congressional oversight of intelligence as well. And the classic example that I give is term limits on the House Intelligence Committee. So you shared before we began, Amanda, that you liked my geeky charts in one of the chapters, which so warms my heart that someone actually likes my geeky charts. But I spent a long time actually calculating expertise on the intelligence committees versus other committees. And I found in the House, because members are forced off the Intelligence Committee after a certain number of years, unsurprisingly, the expertise they have is lower. Their experience, the time on the committee is lower. So typically on the Armed Services Committees, for example, a third of the members are what I call long-termers. So they've been on that committee 10 years or more. Only about 11% of the intelligence committees in a typical year are long-termers. And what that means is, just when you have people that finally have learned all the acronyms of the 18 agencies in the intelligence community, they have to get off the oversight committee. So that if you don't understand the intelligence community very well, you can't ask good questions. And if you can't ask good questions, you can't do your job with effective oversight in terms of making these agencies effective as well as accountable.
That was what was so almost built to fail. I hate to say fail, but it just was staggering to think like there's no rewards for being on these committees. And this book is chock-a-block with wonderful data points and thought points like the powdered milk scenario that you just told us. I mean, if that doesn't scare you a little bit, but so different than, I mean, I guess there's a lot of data about powdered milk, but there's even more data, it seems, nonstop flooding the intelligence field. There is so many ways of collecting now. And how can the community tackle all this nonstop data? How do you sort it? What should they focus on first? Or is it not even data, but other things they should focus on first?
So I think we all experience this we're drowning in data moment, and it's driven by technology. And so if we think about intelligence is really trying to generate insight from needles and haystacks, well, those haystacks are now growing out of control. So just to give some, a data point on this, the amount of data on Earth is estimated to double every 2 years, right? That's just an astounding flood of data. And so, but this is being driven by technological changes, right? The internet, social media. And so what I argue in the book is that these technological changes are driving a number of challenges for the intelligence community. And only one of them is this drowning in data. So I talk about, there are 5 mores. So technology is driving more threats on the threat landscape in cyberspace, more speed at which intelligence analysis has to happen, dealing with all that data, more data that they have to deal with, more customers that need intelligence, voters need intelligence about foreign election interference, tech leaders need intelligence about threats, and more competitors. There are more people out there with cell phones and the internet that can produce intelligence, collect intelligence, and analyze intelligence. And so to get to your original question, which is, how do we make sense of all this? We have to harness technology to do that. AI can do pattern recognition faster than humans can. AI cannot divine adversary intentions better than humans can. So analysts, humans and machines have to team in a much more serious way. And the intelligence community is taking steps toward that, but we're nowhere near where we need to be.
Just a tiny sidebar, because you talked about all, people with their cell phones and being able to do their own research. And you have an interesting, I hate to make you tell me something big in just a little way, but there is such an intriguing chapter about the nuclear sleuths and why they are a problem. And it kind of keys into that question. So I don't know if you would mind, explaining that briefly and commenting on that.
Yeah, so you're hitting on my favorite parts of this research project. So the nuclear sleuths, I took a deep dive into non-governmental open source intelligence detectives, right? And how they operate and what this means for intelligence. And so there is an ecosystem of people ranging from physicists, a colleague of mine at Stanford named Zegart, to hobbyists, sort of a rare coin dealer who by day sells coins and by night makes maps of North Korea. And this open source ecosystem is actually doing remarkable work in many cases at detecting nuclear threats and tracking them. So the most recent publicly known example of this is the discovery over the summer of China's nuclear missile silos. So that was reported in the Washington Post. All revealed by people without security clearances who don't work in intelligence agencies. So using commercial satellite imagery, using openly available information, this is the new world of intelligence. And even in nuclear threats, where you think it's the most secret of the secret and clandestine intelligence would play a dominant role, even here, we see the power of open source intelligence.
Truly was just so many interesting things in the book. Now, when we're getting lots of questions, so I'm only going to ask 2 more, but one of them, because it may solve some of the questions we already have out there, because our audience is always, there are so many threats, but they're always very interested in cyber threats. And you break cyber threats down into 4 main adversaries and 5 types of attacks. I love crunchy bits of data bites. And so can you tell us more about those threats and what the US, how the US is responding or not responding? Very intrigued by that.
So I think, all of us are overwhelmed with what is the cyber threat. And so there are threats and there are threats. So I try to distinguish between the threats that really rise to a national security level and those that we read about every day. So the four big threats, the four big actors are, unsurprisingly, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Now, those four countries have a lot in common. All four of them are major cyber adversaries. All four of them either have or want to have nuclear weapons. All four of them pose, no kidding, physical territorial aggression against their neighbors that are American allies and partners. And all four of them seek to disrupt the international order. So cyber is one part of a portfolio of capabilities and interests of those four countries that make them very concerning. And then we get to well, what can they do? What are the five flavors of cyber attacks, right, if you will? And the five flavors are, and they've been changing over time, right? Stealing, theft of intellectual property, spying, right? Trying to understand what it is that we're doing. Destroying, that would be the Stuxnet example, right? So actually physically destroying something, in this case, Iran centrifuges through a cyber attack. So physical destruction through cyber means. Disrupting, so that would be NotPetya 2017. This is a Russian originated attack against Ukrainian banks that ended up disrupting shipping and businesses around the world, so disruption. And the last one, which is the newest one, deceiving. So cyber threats are now attacking our minds, not just our machines. And so how do we combat that is a really challenging problem. So it's not just about defending machines from cyber attacks that render them inoperable. It's about how do we keep information warfare from polarizing our society and influencing what we think.
Well, this plays very beautifully into my last official question, because deception, brand new, we say, in the cyber world, and oldest time in the intelligence world. And so that leads into this question. There's a lot of wonderful historical pieces in your book. And I'm wondering, you were saying how short the US intelligence history is, and that's true. We're not a terribly old country, but do you have a favorite fact, historical fact, that you picked up writing the book? And then I'll tell you which was my favorite from your book, unless
Okay,
it's
we'll
the
see.
same.
We'll see if they're the same. So I became really interested in early American history as I was writing this book, and the pivotal role that intelligence and deception played in the Revolutionary War. So my favorite thing that I picked up was about Benjamin Franklin. So we think about information warfare as something that's new. It's really the Russians are doing it and they're doing it online. But Benjamin Franklin was the information warfare spy master of his day. He was a printer by trade. When he was in Paris, he set up a printing shop in the basement of his apartment, and he cranked out fake news, literally fake news, with fake ads and fake stories, all designed to inflame and influence public opinion in Europe in support of the Patriots and against the Redcoats. So deception has a long history, and information warfare does too.
Before I tell you mine, do you feel like that's deception? Is it also propaganda? Are those one and the same things, in your opinion, here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's, in that case, it's really kind of blurred. I mean, there's no question that the stories that Benjamin Franklin was producing in his basement were not true, right? So he is spreading false information. Propaganda can be true information that you're trying to get out to the world in order to influence what other people think.
I actually asked that question for some colleagues who are listening in, because they are teaching high school students about propaganda, and that's such a intriguing way. And well, my favorite was George Washington's deception. I just got to thank you for asking that question, from Lucy Stearn. So really interesting stuff, Amy. My favorite was your writing about George Washington building French bread ovens to convince the British that they were staying put where they were rather than moving. And I just loved that, loved it so much. What a
That was one of my favorites too. And I think that what's remarkable about Washington is that he used deception a lot to avoid fighting when he knew he would lose. And for those who are really interested in coordination challenges in intelligence, there's this wonderful letter that he wrote where he forgot the name of one of his intelligence officers, the fake name he was supposed to use. And he writes in the letter, "I've forgotten the name I'm supposed to use, so you'll have to forgive me." So it was hard for him to coordinate his own intelligence apparatus back in the revolution.
Well, we are very proud of the Washington letter we have at the Spy Museum. So I'm shamelessly plugging our artifacts and galleries today. So forgive me for that, but we have so many questions, and I'm going to ask them in the order in which they came in because they are very wide ranging. So it may seem to some folks like we're going back to the beginning of the talk, and that is exactly what we're doing. So back to pop culture, because that's where we began in our conversation. One of our frequent guests wants to know, what entertainment show do you find the most realistic? And I'm going to add, if any.
Oh, it's such a good question. Let me just say, I love spy-themed entertainment as much as the next person, so I don't want to come across as a Debbie Downer on the entertainment industry. But I am concerned that it has negative effects that Hollywood folks haven't thoroughly thought through. In answer to the question, my favorite show that I've seen or movie that I've seen that I feel is fairly accurate until the end, which it's not, is Argo. It's a great story to tell, right? It's, the covert operation to rescue American hostages in Iran who were hiding with the Canadians. And apparently the ending was much less exciting than the movie portrayed it to be. So I'll give Hollywood creative license for that, but that's one of my favorites.
I will share because, Tony and John and Mendez are founding advisory board members and very dear museum friends and personal friends. And they will always say, John will still say, when she watches Argo, when they watched Argo together and the car is chasing the plane down the runway, she's sitting there with Tony. Obviously he got out, like that didn't happen. And they would still get very stressed out and worked up about whether this escape was going to happen. So that's a good movie. That's a good movie ending. Here's a question you will really like from another frequent guest. Is human becoming obsolete due to all these new technological advances?
I don't think human will ever be obsolete, right? So we think about the 2016 Russian election interference and what was publicly reported. How did the IC know that it was directed by the Kremlin? According to what's in the news, there was a human source very highly placed inside the government. So human is never going to go away. It is going to get harder to do, right? How are you going to recruit people in a techno surveillance state, like on the streets of Beijing, for example? It's going to get harder. And we can learn more from data around the world, but you're always going to need humans to try to divine intentions and capabilities.
Well, here's a question that kind of plays into that. A guest asking, as internet systems seem to have taken over, wouldn't the best way to ensure zero hacking and hijacking being to decouple soft targets and sensitive systems from the internet and have them offline and back into the old analog human-based environments of watchful care?
To some extent, that's absolutely right, that we need to go lower tech, not higher tech, if we want to be more secure. But of course, there's a trade-off, right? The less you have connected, the harder it is to do your job and the harder it is to coordinate. So it's a fine line between efficiency and effectiveness and security. We could be 100% secure if we only wrote on stone tablets, right? But we wouldn't get a lot done if we only wrote on stone tablets. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but to illustrate the logic. So yes, I think we need to think more about what can be done entirely offline and what are our, more importantly, I think, what are our backup systems? How do we operate when our computer networks go down? Because the attacker is more likely going to get through than the defender is to prevent that attack. And so we need to be thinking much more about resilience. And resilience is often non-technical backups to technical systems.
Yeah, just a plan B, backups, important stuff.
This is why I tell my kids they need to learn how to read a map and not just rely on GPS.
Otherwise, they end up in a whole other town in Iceland. It's GPS is not infallible. We have a guest who is a former law enforcement intel analyst from London who comes to lots of programs. And he's really interested in talking about the third option when we were discussing covert action. And he wonders if there are historical case studies demonstrating the success of merging covert and overt and the failures. So he wants everything, but he is looking forward to the book.
Well, that's good to hear. I think he's given me the assignment for my next book, which is really looking more clearly at successes in the merging of covert and overt capabilities. So I wish I could give a satisfying answer to that. What I will say is if you read the covert action chapter, one of the things I wanted to do was to walk readers through a real dilemma. And so I posed this dilemma of there's a strong man who has overtaken a democratically elected regime in a country that's strategically important to the US. This strongman used to be a CIA asset, but he's played both sides. He's a notorious drug trafficker, and he's committed terrible human rights abuses. He's now declared his country at war with the United States. What do you do? And so then I walk readers through the, well, what are your choices, right? We're in bad choice territory. And of course, this is taken from the real life story of Manuel Noriega and the invasion of Panama in 1989. So I don't have a good answer to that question, but I do have a really good hypothetical based on the real story of Manuel Noriega.
Well, one guest wants to know, would the Bay of Pigs be a good example of a covert failure?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. That's probably the canonical example of a covert failure.
And then someone wants to know, why do Americans persist in including covert action in their definition of intelligence activity, when this guest considers it an operation that's enabled by intelligence, but is not a component of intelligence itself?
I think that's a really important distinction, that intelligence really is about collection and analysis and exploitation and dissemination of those insights. But the reality is when one agency, the CIA, does the collection and analysis and has authorities for covert action, that's why people tend to lump them together. So I think it's an organizational artifact, right? That's part of what the CIA does. It's not all of what the CIA does. But as we talked about, movies, and we all gravitate toward that covert action, part of the room, that we can't get away from it. It's intriguing, and it's part of what this organization does.
One guest is concerned about analysts who are, worried that machines will take away their jobs. And how can you reassure people that human machine teaming can actually enhance our capabilities? And she was particularly talking about analysts.
So I hear this concern a lot, actually. I think there's no way that machines could ever replace human creativity. So if you look at what AI is good at and what AI is bad at, right? AI is really good if there's a lot of data. It's really good at explaining or predicting the future if the future looks like the past, right? So data in, data out. And as your audience knows, intelligence analysts are often looking at the future that does not look like the past. And they're often looking at things that have very small numbers of prior examples. So AI is not going to tell you, is Iran going to develop a nuclear weapon? It can't. The total number of cases of countries that have developed nuclear weapons is 10. Right? So there's no training data for an algorithm that's going to spit out the answer to tell you what Iran is going to do with its nuclear weapons program. You have to have human analysts for that. But at the same time, you don't want your analysts spending so much time doing mundane tasks like looking at how many surface-to-air missile sites there are in China. That's something that AI can do at superhuman speeds, freeing up the human analysts to do the even harder work, like the work on Iran's weapons of mass destruction program. So the two go hand in hand. I think AI and other technologies can free up the human analysts to focus on the toughest problems, and can help the analyst detect things that they don't have time to see reading. So AI can read and process materials much faster than a human can, and isolate the things that then the analyst can look at more closely.
That's very reassuring, I think, and sounds very accurate and hopeful. So are you familiar with the work of Robert Steele on open source intelligence? What are your thoughts on his work? Can you remind us all of what it is, if that's a question that resonates with you?
So I remember, and this has been a while since I've read his work on open source, but he was an early advocate of open source intelligence. I think he was ahead of his time on that dimension. And what we've seen is, as one former intelligence official put it, the attitude in the intelligence community is, if something costs $1 trillion to get a piece of information,
Right.
it must be worth $1 trillion, right? And that's not true today. We know that's not true today. So open source is almost always free, and yet it can be priceless in its value for insight. And so I think Robert was really early to the party in thinking about the value of open source and how foundational it could be.
We would hear these great stories about KGB assigned here to DC, some of the agents who weren't really working hard, but would literally just read the newspapers and send, because the intelligence was so good from our media, our news, that they could send that back and kind of keep their posting for a while just based on what they could read without having to do any heavy lifting, because we have such a different approach to what we share than so many other countries. When we are working on stories for the museum, and we try to be international, and it's such a challenge because we're so much more out there with what is happening in the intelligence world than other countries are, and kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Keeping it secret.
Yeah, I mean, we do. It's funny. I was talking about this yesterday. There is an asymmetric advantage that authoritarian regimes have. So our internet is free and open. China's internet is not free and open. So China is much more able to gather information about what's going on in the United States than Americans are about what's going on at the Beijing Olympics, for example. So that's just a reality of the information environment in which we live.
One audience member said, years ago, you wrote a private spies article in Hoover's Digest, and you noted a colleague who had a discussion with Assad, who mentioned he was more concerned about Facebook than a US-led invasion. Do you think open source and social media presents an opportunities for closed societies and dictators?
So I'm not quite clear on the nature of the question. And
I'm wondering if they're asking, does it present an opportunity for people who are living in that sort of in a closed society, or does it give the dictator the opportunity to manipulate the people? Perhaps it's both.
I think it's both, right? So we think about early when the Arab Spring erupted, there was a lot of discussion about liberation technology. Remember that the internet would enable the cost of collective action to plummet. People could find like-minded dissidents on the internet. They could coordinate their activities. And this was all going to be on the side of dissidents that favored democracy. Boy, how things have changed. Now we see state techno-authoritarianism, where governments are using technology to repress their own citizens. So the answer, excuse me, with new technology is usually it's both. There are opportunities for promise and there are opportunities for peril. And we're seeing this play out in living color right now.
Also, a guest wants to know, do you feel the Russians are still attempting to subvert our elections? Do you see this evolving since 2016? And do you find it concerning that some politicians are using pro-Russian language?
So, what's been publicly reported about the Russians is the Russians never left. They never stopped influencing American elections. I think they didn't leave in 2016. They tried again in 2018. They're at it again now. So I am very worried, and I'm perplexed by policymakers who are siding with Russia, whether it's on Ukraine or whether it's on other matters of foreign policy. There's no question that Russia is an adversary. Do we have mutual interests? Yes, we always have mutual interests, even with adversaries. But make no mistake, Vladimir Putin's interests are not aligned with those of the United States or our allies in Europe.
Good point. Referencing back to the four big state actors that you mentioned earlier, how much do they spy on each other, and can we use that to our advantage?
Oh, that's another great question I just don't know the answer to. I wish I did. How much do they spy on each other? What I can say is that we do know almost every nation spies on other nations, including their partners and allies. So, there are a handful of countries in the Five Eyes, as I'm sure members of your audience know, that really collaborate closely. So the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Beyond that, it's a jungle out there, and everybody is spying on everybody. We have allies spying on the United States. The United States wants to gather intelligence about how our allies are thinking about things, because knowledge is insight, and insight can help secure and advance the American national interest. And everybody knows it, and that's how this world works.
How do you think current counterintelligence operations should adjust to the challenges faced?
Oh, that's such a big question. It's, one of the things that I think technology has created is counterintelligence failures now can happen faster, and the damage can be much greater. So it's speed and scale. So when you think about counterintelligence challenges of the Cold War, traitors who betrayed the United States, like Robert Hanssen, former FBI special agent, it took him years to gather the thousands of documents he took out and handed to the Russians in little garbage bags, right? One garbage bag at a time, in dead drops around the area. Fast forward to Edward Snowden, who stole an estimated more than 1 million documents in a matter of months, just clicking from the comfort of his desktop before he left for Hong Kong and then for Moscow. So the speed and the scale of damage of one person is much greater now than it was in the past. And what that means is we have to be much better at vetting people when they come in and updating those, are there anomalies in behavior that we need to think about? So really having a continuous clearance, more of a continuous clearance review. And securing our data better so that you only have access to the things you absolutely need, so that if there is a breach, that the damage is more limited.
Now, you talk about Snowden, and opinions of him in the book shaped somewhat by pop culture, because we have a couple more pop culture questions, so I thought I'd circle back to it in this artful fashion. So would you comment on what you found about Snowden, the perceptions of Snowden?
So I think the perceptions really vary depending on where you are. So on university campuses, like where I am now, people often use the word whistleblower and hero. And when the Snowden revelations came out, I did a speaker series at Stanford, and each event throughout the year focused on a different perspective. So I brought Mike Hayden out to Stanford for one of these events, and I said, General Hayden, if you could say or ask one thing to Edward Snowden, what would you say? And Hayden answered immediately. He said, you have the right to remain silent. Which really captures the view, which I share, by the way, that Snowden was not a whistleblower or a hero. He betrayed his country, and he did it by stealing information that was classified, by breaking the law, and making it available in a way that really hurt the national security of the country.
Thank you for commenting on that. And one guest wants to know, how do we balance, you have the big questions, Amy, and you're kind to entertain them. How do we balance using the new wealth of open source information with the possibility of deception through disinformation and misinformation?
Well, I think our intelligence community is going to be they're going to become verifiers of last resort, whether they like it or not. So there's so much that's flying around today, thanks to our connectivity, that the mission for intelligence agencies to get to what's likely to be true, what is a mistaken view that's being perpetrated around the internet, what's misinformation, people spreading information they think is true but isn't, and what's deliberate deception. And so the IC is going to have a much bigger role to play, I think, in the future, as open source plays a much bigger role.
So what is keeping you up at night the most these days?
Well, what worries me the most well, of course, my kids always keep me up at night, right? We worry about our own families,
Right.
even as we think about geopolitics. But when I think about national security level, what keeps me up at night, it's us. The greatest threat to the United States today is the United States. It's our polarization, the fragility of our democracy, this sense that, we're 1 year from the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. The last time the Capitol was attacked was the War of 1812. These are unprecedented moments in our history, a moment of real fragility for our democracy. And I worry that we can't combat the external threats we face, and they're serious and numerous and complex, without much greater unity of purpose and coming together as a country.
So you cite a lack of resources, priorities, and organizations that plagued intelligence agencies before 9/11. Do you think, is that repeating itself? We should be even, more concerned, but are we getting lax again or low resourced?
I think there's a good news, bad news story here, right? The good news is we did reform and adapt in the intelligence community after 9/11. We did see pretty significant change. We did see the National Counterterrorism Center, which has had some real successes. And we did see better coordination and tighter integration between military operations and intelligence. Here's the bad news. The threat landscape never sleeps. So now the threat landscape is very different. And all the things that we are hardwired to do for the global war on terror, now we have to adapt again to a very different threat environment, driven by technology, with more great power competition. And many of those adaptations that we had over the past 20 years are hamstringing us now. So for example, and I wrote a piece about this in Politico, the tight integration between military operations and intelligence served us well in the past 20 years. But the more that the CIA in particular is supporting warfighters on the battlefield, the less the CIA has the resources and attention to preventing strategic surprise, big threats looming over the horizon. And what I write in the piece is that, the military is trained to be hunters. Intelligence officials are trained to be gatherers. And in a world where you can't tell those two missions apart, we're doing something wrong. So only intelligence officials can collect and analyze intelligence to prevent strategic surprise. That's their unique mission. And they can't do it all. So we're now in a moment of rebalancing. And you can see this with Director Burns, and he's taken big steps forward on this at the agency, standing up the China Mission Center, devoting much more attention to technology. But we have to shift, and we have to do it quickly.
Well, taking it back to what we'll get out of the huge thoughts and comprehensive for my two last questions. One, which was very interesting from just the motives of spies. Back to the geeky charts I love, you showed some interesting comparisons between what drove spies in the past and in the present. And I wonder if you would share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so here I get to do my shout out to this wonderful little organization in the Defense Department called PERSEREC, which has gathered this data over more than 50 years based on Americans that have been charged with espionage-related crimes in the country. And so delving into those cases, this organization has identified primary motives for people charged with betraying the country. And so when you look at this data over time, it's pretty interesting. So in the Cold War, for example, the sort of dominant motive was money. right? So, and those who are steeped in counterintelligence know this better than I do. 4 major motives for people to betray their country, and the acronym is MICE. It's money, ideology, compromise, and ego, right? So in the Cold War, the data suggests that the dominant motive was money, followed by ideology. Since the end of the Cold War, those two have flipped, and a much more frequent motive for people to betray their country is conflicted ideology or conflicted loyalties to other countries, followed then by money. So that to me is quite interesting. The other sort of interesting tidbit that comes out of this data set is that very, very, very few people who betray their country are women. Most of them are men. I don't know why, but an interesting thing that comes out of the data set.
Do you think some of the conflicting, being devoted to another country or compromise, is that because we've become a more global world? Do you think there's more opportunity for people to have connections with a past home or a, family's home of origin? I don't know if that even makes sense.
It could be, right? So, what are the hypotheses about what would cause this switch? One could be maybe the data is not very good, and we've just selected based on people who got caught. So the people who got caught were motivated more recently by ideology, and they're pretty bad at what they do. So that's one explanation. One is that foreign intelligence services are getting better at what they do. And so it's really a testament to their success. And then the third possibility could be that because we have so many people from so many places, they may have more divided loyalties. I'm reluctant to think that's the dominant explanation. Yeah. I tend to think that's a source of our strength, not the source of our weakness.
Yeah, as I was asking that, I wasn't sure I was even comfortable asking that question.
But I think the data don't tell us what the answer is. It just, the data just raise the puzzle of why have these motives changed over time.
And as you said, this is the ones who got caught. That's the thing. The greatest spy stories we'll never know because they didn't get caught.
Exactly.
We never know the Argo story if the CIA hadn't encouraged Tony to come forward with it later, much, much later. He never expected to tell that story. So,
and I get this a lot from folks inside the intelligence community when they say, you always write about our failures. Why don't you write about our successes? And part of the reason why is that the successes are often silent, right? So the scorecard that the public knows leans more heavily toward failure than success.
So we brought it back a little bit to pop culture. And when we were talking about pop culture earlier, a number of people wanted to know your take on the Americans.
So I have watched every episode of The Americans. I'm a huge fan of the show. I think they get the 80s right in addition to many other things. So it's a sort of throwback to me. I understand from others who are much well versed in that period that it is more accurate than a lot of other portrayals of sort of the illegals in the program in the United States. And of course, we know that there were these programs. And that the most recent one was rolled up in the 2000s. So this isn't some ancient history from the Cold War. The Russians were at it for a long time.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the spies next door. So thank you for responding to that question. And I want to thank you, Amy, for joining us. And people are so interested in knowing, where can they get the book? And one guest wanted everyone to know it's already on Audible. We are selling it at the Spy Museum store, even signed copies. So Hannah will send the link around to everybody, including that. And this was your first stop on your book tour for this book. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, I have to thank you for having me. I mean, it's not a book tour about a spy book without going to the Spy Museum. So I'm just so delighted.
Well, we sure hope so. And we want to thank our wonderful guests for joining us and asking all these great questions. And we will be sending them, sending the questions that got answered and some that didn't on to Amy after the program. So thanks for coming. We've got some cool upcoming programs. The next thing is a spy love story for Valentine's Day, real folks telling their real story on February 9th. So jump onto our calendar and you can sign up for any of these, adult, youth, all sorts of, one size fits all. We want you here with us. And if you're enjoying the programs, please do consider making a donation, because that's how we get to have cool people like Amy here and offer this to you for free. So thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.